Good afternoon, everyone. My name is DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM. I am an experienced Forge in the Dark GM, and I'm here to offer some advice to you 10 minutes at a time. So today we're talking about a big topic. We're talking about what you need to know to run Candela Obscura and other Forge in the Dark games if you're an experienced D&D DM. So let's get to it. First off, I want to acknowledge what you already know here. As a 5e DM, you're already well on your way to running Candela Obscura. So many of the skills that you already have are going to be one-to-one transferable. You already know how to set a scene. You know how to build a world. You know how to describe action, to make rulings, to prep sessions. Knowing how to do this is going to give you a huge leg up compared to someone just walking in for the first time. So always trust in these skills when running Candela Obscura. Everything that I'm going to be talking about is something that, by and large, you're already doing in 5e games, but with Forge in the Dark games, we just emphasize slightly different things. So let's switch up bases here and talk about what some of these differences are. First off, in genre and style, Candela Obscura is a fiction-first game that takes place in a 1910s horror setting. Fiction-first games want everyone to describe what they're doing and how they're doing it, then figure out which mechanics, if any, are needed. D&D can be fiction first in this way. For instance, the player says, "My character grabs their thieves' tools and starts to pick the lock." And the GM replies, "I'll get you to make a sleight of hand check with proficiency." That's pretty standard, but that is fiction first. The player is describing what their character does, and then the GM is applying a mechanic to it. But it doesn't have to be. A player can say, "Can I roll perception?" And the GM can reply, "Sure, give me a roll for that." In Forge in the Dark games, we always want to lead with a description rather than invoking the rules. Stuff like, "Aurora smiles. Can you tell me more about this project?" Probably makes a sway roll. "Brooklyn draws their sword cane, slashing at the monster's chest." Probably strike. "Finley furrows their brow, thinking back to their notes on cryptids." Likely a study. Always ask the players to describe what their character is doing, and then always respond to those actions by describing what happens in the scene. Next up, 1910s horror. D&D is about playing heroic characters in a heroic age. The more experienced you get as an adventurer, the harder it is to die. When you see a monster, the usual answer is to draw steel and run at it. Your characters are immortalized in bard stories. You're expected to succeed, maybe at a cost, but not necessarily. Candela Obscura is about playing heroic characters still, but they're in over their heads. The more experienced you get, the closer you are to death or retirement. When you see a monster, the usual response is to run from it, learn something about it, or try to anyways, or exploit one of its weaknesses. Your characters end up being a footnote in Candela Obscura's private records. No fame, really. And you're probably still going to succeed, but it's going to come at some great cost. These genre conventions are a little bit different between the two games, and as GMs, our job is to reinforce the themes and tone of the game. We want to describe how overwhelmingly powerful the monster is. We want to paint new fare in darkness and in light. We want to show the humanity in horror and the horror in humanity. We want to make a move when the fiction demands it. We want to enact success at a price when presented with that option. And ultimately, we want to put our players on edge, as is fitting of the horror genre. Next up, we move to Abstraction. Forge in the Dark games are more abstract than D&D. As in, we don't have as many specific mechanics, things like hit points, encumbrance, things like that. In Candela Obscura, we're constantly managing this ambiguity. And one of the tools we have to do that is the conversation. D&D is a rules-heavy game relative to Candela Obscura. For falling, when you fall in D&D, there's an answer to how much damage you're going to take. When you fall in Candela, how hurt you get depends on the context. In 5e, gear has specific effect, like +2 AC or something like that. But in Candela, gear can change expectations or stakes, depending specifically on the context. Rather than many explicit exceptions, Candela Obscura and Forge in the Dark games use a series of abstract principles. The conversation is our primary tool to adjudicate them. This is the step between when a player describes their action, but before they roll their dice. As a GM, we want to listen to the character's approach, then determine the action that they are likely wanting to use and the objective. And from that description, we attach an action to it, we determine the action stakes, how dangerous it is, and then we explain expectations around the action, as in how well is this likely to go. For instance, if a character is trying to disrupt a ritual, we don't know what the rules of the ritual are. It's not really written down, but based on how a character approaches the situation, we might be able to infer an action here. If they describe themselves punching a cultist in the jaw, it's very likely a strike roll. Maybe they're trying to incant some kind of counterspell for a sense. Maybe they're stealing one of the ritual components using a high check. Then, based on those dice, we are going to narrate the results. And here I'm assuming a mixed success on all of these. You shatter the cultist's jaw, and the ritual starts going wild. You counterspell begins its work, and we set up a countdown die to manage it. You steal a candle, but strange spirits manifest to protect it. Candela Obscura's setting is also way less defined as well. We have districts, but no district maps, organizations, but little direction on their actual motives, almost nothing on Hail, basically no information about Otherwhere, very little on phenomena, thinnings, and the flare, and more questions than answers when it comes to the true nature of Candela Obscura as an organization. In D&D settings, we'd expect a lot more guidance here, but there are definite advantages to having these gaps. We have less information overload, for instance. We're not overwhelmed with the amount of detail that we're receiving about the setting. We can define what needs to be defined when it needs to be defined, and not in advance. And that makes it contextual, as I've mentioned before. We can also invite our players to build the world with us. Player asks maybe, what's the population of Newfair? And we can ask, what do you think it is? We are all co-authors of this world. And if there were too many details, it would be difficult to do this, and you'd be looking through books all the time trying to find out exact answers. Also, you can incorporate the details of the world into characters' backgrounds more fluidly. And ultimately, what's great about it is your Newfair is going to be a lot different than my Newfair, and that makes the setting stronger and more attached. Like, I'm more attached to my Newfair than I would be otherwise. All settings, no matter what, give us permission to change what we don't like, but Candela Obscura gives us a canvas that we can paint on. Ooh. So, let's take a little bit of a break here. This has been a long one. Hey there. Are your fingers bored? Idle? Waiting for something to do? Why not have it click the subscribe button? That way you'll get a new video every week beamed directly into your brain. Or don't. I'm not your finger's boss. Anyways, back to the video. Next up we have the fiction and failing forward. In D&D, when you fail a roll, often nothing happens. You fail to spot a secret door. You miss the goblin archer. In Forge in the Dark games, though, when you fail, the situation must change. You might spend time looking for a secret door, which means that a guard patrol is coming around. You miss the goblin, and it shoots you with its bow. This is called failing forward, and it ensures that you're not rolling over and over waiting for something to happen. That you're able to progress the story even with a poor roll, and it also encourages you to try riskier, character-driven things rather than the optimal response at all points. As a GM, when your PCs roll a failure, we want to make a move and narrate what happens, and if they roll a mixed success, we do want to give them what they want, but also make a move as well. Which brings me to moves. Moves are things that you as a GM can do to complicate a scene. In D&D, you have instances where you make rolls. Monsters act on their turn in the initiative order, traps are placed in preset places and go off when triggered. But in Candela and Forge in the Dark games, the players are making all of the rolls. When they roll a failure or a mixed success, this is when you get to do something. That might be making a monster act or trigger a trap. There are all kinds of moves, so I recommend reading up on them on page 160 of the main book, and also consequences on page 12. As a GM, when we're looking at what move we want to make sure that we are upping the tension in a scene, we're making the PC's lives more difficult, we're foreshadowing what is to come, we're saying no and, or yes but, in those situations, and then we're controlling the pace of a session. It can be beneficial to think about the kinds of moves before session that you might want to apply in a given scene that you expect to have, but the best moves reflect the context of the current situation. Using moves is probably the biggest gap in knowledge from 5th edition to Forged in the Dark, and fortunately for you, I have an entire playlist on running those, which I'm happy to link above. Next, playing to find out what happened. In D&D, normally, we know what the monsters can do. We know what happens when a PC fails a roll, what the encounter is going to look like beforehand. All of this is planned out. In Candela Obscura, we expect our players to surprise us. We don't prepare encounters, we prepare situations or obstacles. We leave our clues floating about so we can reward player cleverness and keep the store going. I've got an article on that too, which again I can link above. We let the context of the moment determine what happens next. And we keep ideas held very loosely and adapt those ideas to fit the fiction of the moment. This is playing to find out what happens. The table is discovering the story together. We're holding on to ideas loosely and seeing where that's going to take us. And as a GM, we should be making bold decisions with our moves. Don't be boring. Really push things. Embrace consequences. Give authority to players to make the game their own, and intuit the fictional position of the game and follow it to its natural conclusion. You've seen plenty of movies. You know what's likely going to happen next if you were in a movie, so go ahead and do that. And lastly, let ourselves be surprised with where things go. Last point here, trust. Forged in the Dark games are about trust. Trusting that everyone at the table is playing the game in good faith, that everyone is going to react to what's happening with sincerity, because horror games break down when people treat them flippantly. And lastly, trust that the GM is going to properly set expectations and make moves that fit the fiction. D&D has a lot of rules. It has these little guide rails, these little bumpers in place that stop bad faith actors. It relies on a more tangible rule set. Candela Obscura doesn't have that, so instead, we basically say, hey, players, don't be jerks. Play the game as it's intended. And as a GM in Candela Obscura, you should be empowering your players to push the limits of their authority, ask them questions to create their world, let them take creative approaches to problem solving that may not easily apply to a rule, and allow them to stretch their abilities if it results in a better story. Anyways, that's an awful lot. I think I've said my piece. I hope that helps you better understand how to apply your GM skills in Candela Obscura. I've been DM Rawlings, your 10-minute DM, and I'll catch you later.